G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. Today I have a beautiful new pattern. It's a very rainy day today here in Oz. You can hear that rain. Perfect day for sewing. So we've got this beautiful little kitty cushion and very easy to make, even good for beginners, this one. It looks very impressive with all of its quilting, but it's a very simple method. I'm going to walk you all the way through it. All you need is your free pattern templates, and I have those ready for you. They are in the description box below. You simply need to click on that link and you'll be able to print out your free pattern templates. Now, when you go to print them out, make sure you check your printer settings and print at actual size, and that way you won't have any problems with the sizing of those templates. So, are you ready? Let's get busy. So let's begin with what we'll need to make this little project. Now, if you have been following me and you have made this little owl cushion, this one is put together in almost exactly the same way. We're going to be doing a quilt as you go method on the front panel before we cut out our front piece. So what we start with is a panel, and your measurements are there in your pattern templates. And I use an off-white because it won't interfere with my other colours that I'm putting over it, and it will keep them all true. So I've got that panel interfaced with my fusible woven cotton interfacing, and that panel is cut exactly to size. Make sure you follow those measurements there on your templates. And that one is all ready for us to add our strips. But what we're going to be starting with this little one is a starting point, which is our little section there, which is our little diamond shape, and it has our two little fish there right in the center, so very similar to our little owl there in the middle. And we begin our quilting as we go around that piece. So at the very beginning we're going to leave the little fish off, and that one will be pressed on first, and then we'll do our quilting as we go. So the strips you're going to need for our quilting are all 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch wide. Now, I've just taken the colors that I want to depict my little cat, and I've got some light ones, some dark ones, and I've cut them all to around about 28 centimeters. I won't need anything longer than that, and some of them I'll cut in half. So just a random selection there that I have. We're also going to be needing the back pieces for the cushion, and they are cut from just one of my chosen fabrics, and they have that fusible woven interfacing on the back as well. You'll also need your base piece, which is treated in exactly the same way. Make sure that you transfer all of your markings because you'll be needing those. And we need our little face details, and they will be the little muzzle section, which I've cut from felt. I just find that it stands out best, but you can definitely do it with fabric. And we will have our two little eye pieces, also with fusible webbing applied to the back, as with the little nose piece. And I'm going to be using a green button, and I'm going to be double buttoning and adding a little black one in the center. We're going to be stitching around those, so all of those little features will really stand out. We're also going to need our little tail pieces. Now, you can make the tail any length you like, but the measurement for your pieces, the width of the tail, is 5 centimeters or 2 inches. And so long as all of your pieces are cut to 2 inches, it doesn't matter how long they are. We're not going to be matching up seams when we do this tail. We're going to make it really easy, and we're just going to put it all together very random and then put those two tail pieces together. So again, I've just cut from the same fabrics some little pieces that are all 5 centimeters in width. The only piece I've given you for the tail is the tip of the tail, so that when that little tail comes around the kitty, there's a little turn up at the end there. So all of our pieces will be added to each side of this one, and none of those pieces have any treatments on them at all. It's rare that I do that, but I want this little tail to be quite soft and to wrap around kitty well. So that's why there's no interfacing on those pieces, including those two little tail pieces. And we're also going to be needing our extra strong threads and I'm going to be using those for the applique embroidery. Also a little bit of black pearl thread. We're going to be stitching a nose mouth section in there. You can do that on the machine, or you can do it by hand with your pearl thread. And that's about it. Polyester filling to fill with, and you'll find that it's a really straightforward pattern. And if you haven't done this Quilt As You Go method before, it's really fun. You need to have your iron ready because we press all the way through. So the first piece that we add is our little diamond, and it goes lengthwise, so the longer ends are at the side. And the position for that one is very exact, and it's 4.5 centimeters from the base there. And you need to make sure that it is centered right in the middle there, and that everything's nice and even. Make sure that line is running nice and straight across. And the reason why it has to be exactly where it is when we add our pattern template, which we will be doing, we will be putting our pattern template over the top once we have that panel all quilted, and we will be cutting that one out from there, and we need a certain amount of room to make sure that everything sits in the right place. And so that measurement is very important. So 4.5 centimeters from the base to the point, the lowest point of that little diamond. Get that one pressed into place using a hot iron and a protective cloth. Once you have that one pressed into place, we're going to start with the first of our strips. Now I've cut one of my strips in half because I don't need it to be that long. I like to start with the top edge, but it doesn't really matter where you start on which edge, but I like to start with this top one here. And all I'm going to do is I'm putting right sides together. So the right side of my strip, and this is the right side. And I'm going to line up that edge there with the top edge of that little diamond shape. And I'm going to take it to the machine, and now the seam allowance throughout is 4 millimeters. You don't want to go larger than that. And 4 millimeter seam allowance, we're going to sew from where that edge finishes straight to the other edge there. And once that's stitched into place, we're going to press that one back. And that's the start of our little frame up around our little diamond. So that's our first. Let's get that first strip on, and then I'll show you how that looks. My first piece is in place, and I've pressed that one back, and I've just trimmed those ends. So then we add our next strip, and I'm going to go on that lower edge now. Again, I'm lining it up with the edge of that little shape, and this time I'm going to be stitching from what is the edge of that little diamond to right to the edge of our first piece. So we're extending it out, and then we're going to press that one over. So there my second piece is in place, pressed over, and you can see I'm just trimming those slightly each time. So my next piece will just line up with the base there, and again the stitching goes to the end of the piece we just added and just to the edge of that diamond. Flip that one over and press it, and then repeat with that final piece to frame up that little diamond. So there we go, that has our little diamond nicely framed up. You can see that's where our little fish will go. They will fit nicely in there. We do that a bit later on. So now all we need to do is continue to build on what we've already done there. So I'm back to where I started. So I'm going to lay my strip. It's still always right sides together. And each time my stitching extends to the edge of the last pieces put on. So I'm just going to continue around and keep building, and you'll find that you'll get to a point where you're just having to add pieces to the sides because of the angles that's growing. It'll keep coming out, and it'll keep growing in a diagonal just like on this one. So as you're adding your strips, be mindful of the colours that you're using. If you want to create any kind of sort of pattern or colourway, just be aware of how that's growing, and that your little face is going to be up here. I will add a couple of lighter coloured pieces to indicate a bit of a chest with some light colour here, and frame it up in the dark for my kitty. But you can see how you can do that and build that colour. So I'm going to keep going for a while, and then I'll give you a little progress report as we go along. So let's have a little progress report here, and I've made my way up there, and it helps sometimes to pop your little fish there and to get a good look at what you're doing with your colour layout. So you can see what I've done there. I've just continued on building up all of those colours, bit of lightness throughout here, and now I need to be mindful of my little kitty going into the top of the head and the little ears, and be thinking about the colours that I want for there. It's helpful for you to grab your template, pop it over the top and have a little look at where everything is before you can continue on. You can see also that I've trimmed off those little edges, and that gives me a clearer look as well. Also notice that the colours that I chose to go around that central diamond are quite bold and different from that pale blue, so that little diamond really stands out. So now I'm going to continue on, and I'm going to keep on going until my entire back front panel is completely covered. And there I have my completed quilted panel there. So that one's all ready for us to now take our pattern template of our front, and we want to pop that one on the front and line that up. Now what we need to do is, because we've got nice exact measurements, and because we kept those measurements nice and exact, we can make sure that that little diamond there is right in the center. And I like to start that template as low as I can, and it's also why we trim up that edge so we can really see where we're at. So I take it only just about 1 centimetre from the base there, and I will make sure that my center line is lined up with my little triangle. And if you do your pattern template in 2 pieces like I have, you can actually flip it over like that, alternatively just fold it over, and you can see that it's all lined up and everything will be in place. And then you just trace around that, and then we get that one cut out. And that has my front panel pattern shape all cut out nicely. You can lay out your pieces there, and you have give yourself a good idea of how that's all going to come together. And you can see why I use the felt there for those pattern pieces. It really does give that little bit of volume that really lifts everything out. Now the first thing we're going to do, we're going to leave the little face pieces for now. We're going to add our little fish pieces in his little belly, and they are just made up of 2 pieces. So I will press on the little base piece first. They've both got fusible webbing applied, and then that little body section over the top. I've got them going alternative ways, and you'll find they'll just tuck in there nicely. So I'm going to get those pressed on with a hot iron and a protective cloth. So I have those 2 little fish pressed into place there, and you can see that I'm going to just use a little tiny bead for each of those eyes. If you don't want to use a bead, you could just do a little cross there, would work as well. I'll just remove those because I'll do those in a moment, but for now I'm going to take this one to the machine, and I'm going to stitch very close to the outside edge of each of those shapes to settle those in place. You could sew a blanket applique stitch, but there are a lot of layers there and you'll find that quite tricky. So I think the machine stitch around it keeps it all very neat and defines those shapes well. So I'm going to get those in place and also add my little beads. Right, so I have my little fish in place, little beads sewn in place too. So now I've gone ahead and I have added my little muzzle piece, and I've pressed that one into place. Now that one is exactly 3 centimeters from the top of the head to the tip of that little muzzle section. Again, make sure that it's centered right in the middle and get that one pressed into place. So from there, again, it's just a matter of choosing how you sew that one on. Now this time, because I'm not going through layers of heat and bond and so on and fusible webbing, we're just going through quite soft fabric. So I'm going to sew a blanket applique stitch on this one because it really does frame this little piece up nicely and makes it stand out. So I've chosen one of my deeper shades from my project, a nice rust brown, and I've got a single thread, and I'm using my extra strong thread here, and because the thread doesn't fatigue as it goes through the fabric, and I find it very, very good for this sort of work. So it's a blanket applique stitch. Now I've just come in from behind right on the edge. The little knot in the end has held behind, and I've gone through both the layers there for my first stitch and come out right on the edge again, and I'm bringing my needle out through the loop. Now if you haven't sewn a blanket applique stitch before, I am going to put a link up the top there for you so that you can have a look at that video I have that shows you how to do that. But you can see here we're just keeping those stitches nice and small and nice and even, going through all the layers and coming out right on the edge of that shape, bringing my needle through that loop and pulling that one in, and that's going to give us that beautiful little binding edge. And I do like that little bit of hand stitching with this one. You can of course take that to the machine if you prefer. If you don't like hand stitching, take it to the machine and you can sew a straight stitch, or you could sew a close little zigzag all around the edge of that one. But you can see that that's the effect that I'm going for, and I'm going to keep going right the way around. I'm going to keep rotating my work as I go, so all of those stitches are going out straight out from the edge, and then we'll come back and we will press on our two little eye pieces. Now they will be treated in exactly the same way. Now they are an ellipse, they're not a circle, so make sure that you've got them tucked in, and they need to be tucked in fairly close. You can see where they sit, and it always helps to add your other pieces. So add your other pieces so you get a good idea of how that's going to look. But I usually find it's probably 6 millimeters from the edge of the little muzzle template there. Again, make sure they're all lined up. I tilt them outwards slightly, that little ellipse shape, and we will get this one stitched in, and then press these two on, and I'm going to sew the same stitch around each of those eye pieces. So now I've got all of my little face pieces stitched into place. You can see I've gone ahead there and added that little nose. That one sits just a little bit less than a centimetre from either side there. Make sure it's nicely centred again. And then I've gone in and I've just used my fine pen, drawn a straight line for that top lip, and just added a little smile there. You can use whatever you have, just the bottom of a cotton reel works really well. Draw that one into place, and now you can either stitch that one in by hand using perhaps a pearl thread there. I'd use an 8-ply, or you can go ahead on the machine. I'm going to sew that one on the machine. I'm just going to sew that 2 times, just make sure that outline is really clear, and I will use black. And then I will sew my little buttons in place for my eyes, and I like to put them at the top edge and add my little, turn them inward just a little, just for that little quizzical look. But of course you could centre them. It does make a difference where you put those little eyes. You can see that I've got that one turned in, but you can put, if you put them right in the centre, you get a much more surprised look, more startled look, so totally up to you. So I will get all of those in place. And there we go. So we have our completed little kitty front. And now we can actually pop that one aside, because before we move ahead we need to create our tail. So our tail gets fitted into the back seam. So I've got each of my little tail end pieces here, and those are my right sides there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each piece individually, and I have cut my 5 centimetre or 2 inch strips to create a tail. So what I'm going to do with each one is I'm just going to put right sides together, and I'm going to keep on adding strips as I go, all different strips. Stitch them all together to create a little patchwork stripy tail. And what I'll do is I'll do that with each one of those, and I will measure that tail to be approximately 38 centimetres, so, or around about 15 inches. So now you can make that tail longer or shorter. That's why I haven't given you a definite. The size that I'm making it about 38 centimetres or 15 inches just means that it will wrap around his body and just curl up in front of him. But you may want to make it really long, a real funky sort of a look, so that's up to you. So, but I'm going to keep mine at that length, and I'm going to create those. And as I said, I haven't made the pieces all the same size, so that we're not trying to match up seams when we sew those two pieces together. So I'll press that as I go and get all of those little tail pieces into place. So there I have my two tail pieces all stitched together very randomly with my little squares, and I've just lined those up there. Now I've ended up making mine around about just over 40 centimetres. So as I always encourage you with my patterns is to put your own little spin on it, make it any length you like. It's up to you how far you go. If you don't try, you'll never know. But I'm going with about just over 40, and we'll see how that goes. So now all I need to do is see I've clipped that end together, and I'm just going to stitch all the way around that little pattern piece, and I'm going to leave that end open. You'll also notice that I've pressed all of those seams forward. I've done it forward because when we're adding a little bit of filling, of course, that's the direction that the filling's going in. So it just reduces the bulk. So I'm going to get that one stitched up and turn through. There we go. So we have a little, looks like a little hockey stick, doesn't it? A little hockey stick tail. Okay, so that's all turned through. And what I'm going to do now is, and I must apologise, that's the rain that you can hear. I apologise, but my very thirsty garden is very happy to have it. So, and there's nothing better than sewing inside on a rainy day. So let's add some filling to this little tail, and I'm using my forceps, which is the easiest way to get it in there. Now I'm really not going to add too much, but I do want to make sure that the end of this little tail is just filled out a little bit. We want to keep it all very soft so that when we go to wrap it around our little kitty, it will do so nicely. So I'm just going to basically fill the end, that little white tip, yours might not be white or cream, and I'll just fill that one up to about here, and then just very, very lightly fill the rest. It's got a bit of substance because of all the pieces anyway, and that will wrap around our little kitty cushion just like that. So once you've got enough filling in there, you just take that to the machine, and we're just going to stitch that little edge closed, ready to go in that back seam. So you can see there that little tail, it's all quite soft, just a bit firmer at the end, and really nothing here because this is going to be tucked into that seam. So now we're going to sew our centre back seam, and I've got my two back pieces. Now you can see there that what I've done on that opening, which you've got between your marks there, I've sewn a tight little zigzag stitch, a close little zigzag stitch, and that just keeps those edges from fraying, and it keeps them nice and true and stops them from stretching. So when we go to close that opening with a ladder stitch, it's nice and even. So you can see there what I've done, I've just lined up those edges, and you're going to stitch. Now this time the seam allowance is a little bit bigger, so closer to your, what perhaps you call your 1/4 inch, round about 5 to 6 millimetres. So we're just going to stitch down to that mark there, and I do sew this seam 2 times, and then our next section is from the lower edge of that opening to the base. But what we're going to do is incorporate our little tail as we do so. So we're going to slip that in between the edge. You can stitch it into place first if you like, and we want to leave around about, oh, it's about 1.5 centimetres from the base there. That's our positioning, so that when we sew our base in, this tail isn't interfering with that. So about 1.5 centimetres, just enough room for that tail to sit nice and flat there. And we will incorporate that in, make sure that you're really back and forth over that seam, and we will have that back seam ready to open out, add to our front. So there we go, we've got our little back seam sewn. with that opening left and our little tail is nicely incorporated. Do make sure when you put that little tail in that that little end is turning upwards. Right, so that's all ready. We can just move that little tail out the way, and now we're just going to take our completed front and we're going to line that up, and we're simply going to sew the entire outside edge. Make sure that you've clipped or pinned all the way around. Starting at the base here, make sure you're back and forth, and we're going to sew right the way around that one, staying with that 5 to 6 millimetre or just about a 1/4 inch seam allowance right the way around, and I will do that 2 times. Okay, so I've got my little final seam stitched there right around that outside a couple of times, and you can see that I've gone around with my pinking shears and just notched that edge. If you don't have pinking shears, definitely at least do these little curves here with the tips of your scissors and take just the tip points off of those ears. When it turns through, it will turn through much easier and you'll get a nice clean point on the top of those ears. So now we're going to add our base. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pop that little tail and pull that through that little opening so that's out of the way. And we're going to take our pins, and our base has 2 little marks on it. So those are your center points and they line up with your side seams. So what I've done is I've just pressed that little seam nice and flat on the side there, and I'm just going to take my little base piece and I want to line up that mark with the very, very center of that seam, and I will just pop a pin straight through there. Push that pin head all the way down, flip that one over and do exactly the same with the other side. Lining that one up. And you'll find if you've kept to your seam allowances, this little base piece will fit in beautifully. So once they're both anchored, you know that you can just pin it right the way around and it will be even either side. So I take my pin through both layers, flip it over, and a little bit of fabric on the other side, push my pin head all the way down. Now I do sew this base piece in on the machine because it's large enough for us to get in there, which is good. So it's just a matter of getting that little one all pinned in right the way around. You can see how I'm pinning there, and that has it all tucked in nicely, and you'll find your pins are out of the way. Now what I do like to do though is I go around with my extra strong thread and I just sew an overcasting stitch right the way around that one, because then I can remove my pins and it's easy to tuck under the machine and sew that seam. And often I'll actually just hand sew those 2 opposing side corners there, just because it's easier than going around that little corner on the machine, and I do that just with a little stab back stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and get that little base piece into place. Once you've got that base plate in, it's simple as turning this one through. This is the only time it's ever going to be okay to pull Kitty's tail. So I'm going to turn that one through and I'm going to push out all of those seams using my knitting needle and get those seams all rolled out nice and flat. And there we go, that has our kitty, all those seams rolled out beautifully, and you can see there, because we clipped those little ear tips, we've got a lovely little point. It's all those little things that make the difference. So now all we need to do is fill this little kitty up, of course through that back opening, and I'm going to start right up the top here with the ears. So I'm going to really pack those ears nice and firm. Now I like these little cushions to be packed very, very tight. It just prolongs their life, and we don't want those ears to be sagging. We want them to sit up nice. So I'm using my forceps. I'm really packing that in there. And if you want to hold that filling up there while you're filling the rest of the body, because when you have a small space opening out into a large space with filling, it wants to drop back in there, and it can be quite difficult to keep those tops of those ears firm. So you can actually pack it all in there nicely, and then you can throw a couple of pins through while you're filling the rest of the body, and that way, once you're all done, pull those pins out and you've got that nice firmness has stayed in that ear. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that little one up nice and tight. And so there we go, that has my little kitty all filled out. So he's nice and firm. You can see that little tail will wrap around the front there. And now all we need to do is close that opening at the back. And you can see there that that's all been packed in there nice and tight. I have used my wool felting needle just to tuck those fibres in and keep them out the way. And you can see that I need to pull those edges in to make those meet. So that's how firm that little cushion is packed. And I'm going to start with my extra strong thread. Now we're using a ladder stitch to close this one, and I have a single strand with a very big knot at the end, a few knots on top of each other. I don't know if you can see that there. And we're going to start. Now I've got a video that shows you how to sew a ladder stitch or an invisible stitch for closing. I'll put that link up the top there for you if you want to have a look at that, but I'll show you how I start here. So I'm going to go in underneath that seam. It's a bit hard to see because I'm using dark thread, but I need to so that it will be as invisible as possible. So I'm taking my needle up to where that seam just starts to open at the very beginning. Now that knot is going to hold nicely there. So that's on that side. So now I'm going to move across to the other side, exactly in the same position, and I'm going to take one stitch. Travel down and take one stitch. Easier done this way. So, and I'm going to keep my stitches nice and small. So you can see there I've just travelled across. Oh, it's probably very difficult to see. There we go. So I've travelled across, and then I'm going to backtrack, and I'm going to dive back in to the first hole that I came out of, where my knot is. And I'm going to take one stitch down, just as I did the other side, keeping it nice and even. So my stitches need to be the same length as we travel down. Very difficult to show you on camera effectively. That's why that video is helpful to you. So that's my second stitch that's travelled across, and if I pull that in, you can see that that's pulled that little section in together, and then I will just repeat that process and go back into that same little hole, travel down a little and pull that one in. Now you need to make sure as you go that you are pulling those threads up each time. They will slacken off as you go to make your next stitch. You can see that I'm pulling that in. I will just trim those little frayed edges. I'm pulling that in, and it will pull that seam in together all the way down. Now do make sure you keep pulling that after each stitch, because if you don't, you're going to get halfway down and try and give it a good pull, and they will not knit together. So give it a good pull each time. Remember to be pulling those edges in as you go. Yours may not be filled as firm as mine. I'm used to filling everything this firm, and I will travel all the way down to the base there and close that opening. And there we have our completed cat cushion. Beautiful novelty cushion. I got just the spot for this one. A really funky little chair that he's going to sit on. So I hope you've got a spot for one as well, and I'm very excited to see the colours that you're all going to come up with. Please send me pictures of this little one. He looks very fat and very content there with his belly full of fishes. So what I've done there with the tail, you can leave the tail just hanging loose if you like, but I have actually taken my my longest doll needle, and I've had a double thread, and I've just gone through the back there, taken a little stitch of that tail, pulled it back through and just tied it in there and snipped it off. And so that little tail, and it really does, if you tuck the little tail in like that, it makes it very, very stable, and you can see it can just stand up on its own. We've got no base in there except for just filling, so that does really well. But nestled amongst cushions on your sofa, absolutely fabulous. And do remember, if you've liked making that one, the little owl one is there for you as well, and that's made in exactly the same way. So I hope you've enjoyed making my little cat cushion. So thank you all for joining me today, and it was a very quick and easy project, wasn't it? Really quite an impressive looking project for very little work. That's what I like. So I hope you've enjoyed it too. You can give me a thumbs up if you have enjoyed it. That would be absolutely beaut. Make sure that you're following me on Instagram, and you can see these little patterns coming up before they actually go up. You can be ahead of the game, have all of your materials all ready, all your bits and pieces all ready to start. So make sure also that you subscribe if you haven't, because you're missing out on all of the fun and all of the free patterns, and there will be so many more. Now there will be some little scissor covers coming up. I have to stop myself from making too many needle book covers because I do love them, but there will be more of those, and there's always going to be new characters coming up. So everybody stay creative, stay safe, and make sure that you pay all of those good things forward. Until next time, it's hooroo from me.